This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt stuck, whether it's a major life transition, a dark night of the soul, or just staying small out of fear. If you've ever struggled to move forward, if you're repeating unhealthy patterns in relationships, or you have a black belt in beating yourself up, you were meant for more, and this podcast is for you. We'll get real, we'll get vulnerable, we'll probably cuss a little bit, and we'll get to the root of it all, your self-worth. With every step, you'll find the courage to rise. Welcome to episode 9 of the Courage to Rise podcast. We're going to talk about perfectionism today. And I suspect that quite a few of you might consider yourself to be perfectionists or recovering perfectionists. And I want to talk about this today because it's something that comes up with a lot of clients. It's something that comes up with a lot of people. And I'm here to tell you right now that perfect is bullshit. There is no such thing as perfect. And as someone who spent the majority of her life holding herself to an impossible standard and then beating herself up mercilessly when she didn't meet or exceed that same impossible standard, I've done the field research, and I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that perfect is not a thing. I want to be clear that there's a very distinct difference between holding high standards and holding yourself to an impossible standard. And that's really what this is about, is making that distinction where you can have a high standard for yourself. You can have a high standard for your life, for the quality of work you put forth in the world. You can have high standards without holding yourself to this ephemeral concept of perfection. And for me, I found that I wore this idea of, I'm a perfectionist. I wore it almost like a badge of honor, as though somehow it was a testament to, I don't know, how talented I was or something. It was like, I'm just a perfectionist. So it was this excuse for me to be this completely stressed out mess all the time. And really what I was is exactly that. I was a neurotic mess, desperately overcompensating for the fact that I felt chronically unworthy. And while I wasn't consciously aware of it, I felt like if I were only perfect, then I'd be worthy of love and worthy of acceptance. Because in a nutshell, and I'm about to drop a truth bomb here, but perfectionism is just fear in a prettier outfit. We hide behind this concept of perfectionism because really what's underneath it is we're terrified of being rejected, of not being accepted, or of being unloved if we don't meet this completely impossible standard. And oftentimes we operate as though everyone else in the world has it together and we're the only ones who don't. And there's this concept of imposter syndrome, which if you're not familiar with it, I suspect on some level somewhere in your life you've had this come up where you feel like you're a fraud, where everyone else has their stuff together and you don't, but you're just scrambling as fast as you can to keep them from figuring that out. And that's part of where this idea of wanting to, be perfect comes from, that somehow everyone else is doing everything perfectly and we're not. And I had a really good client example that I wanted to share. I was talking with a client about how stressed out she got when, she and her husband would have dinner parties and they would have friends over. And that was a part of her life that she actually really enjoyed, because family and friends and that connection is something that was a value of hers that was very important. And so they enjoyed hosting these dinners. But what would happen is that she would get so stressed out. She was unable to delegate, unable to let anybody else help her, and she would get so stressed out about this dinner being perfect, right? What does perfect even mean? But about this dinner being perfect. And her husband would comment to her, basically, I don't know if we need to continue doing these dinner parties because it just, you get so stressed out about it. And, he's very practical, and all he's saying is this isn't actually creating any joy, it's just creating stress. So she and I sat with it, and I told her, I said, I want you to imagine now that you're going to a dinner party that someone else has planned. And there are going to be two versions of this dinner party that we're envisioning. And in one, the woman is operating the way that you have been. She's worried about every single detail. She's, overly stressed out about everything, wants everything to be quote unquote perfect, right? And I ask her to tell me, what is the energy you get if you go to that dinner party? Because other people can feel that, right? And you've probably been in those situations where you're operating with people who are coming from that place of intensity and that desire for, somehow wanting to reach this impossible standard of perfection. And she said, well, it would actually be a little uncomfortable, right? Like you can feel her stress, you can pick up on it. And I said, okay. Now in the second example, I want you to imagine that you're invited over to a dinner party and you show up, and the woman hosting it she's very relaxed, and she says, hey, listen, we had a big issue with dinner, and whatever it was that I was going to cook tonight, it just really didn't work out. So listen, we're just going to order pizza instead, right? Or that, her house is clean, but maybe it's not immaculate. And, how much different does it feel in those two scenarios? Because here's the other thing, is that we often operate from this idea that everyone else is perfect, or that we have to pretend to be perfect for each other. But I want to ask you who you relate to more. We relate to people that show their vulnerability and show their humanity. So if you've ever planned a dinner party or planned a party at all, things don't always go right? Like especially if you've ever planned, let's say, a wedding, things are going to go wrong. And how you keep yourself out of that is, first of all, you recognize this perfectionism that's coming up for you. And we'll talk about where it comes from in a minute, but you recognize it. And then you refocus on, what's my outcome? What am I going for with this? And in this example with my client, I said, let's focus on what outcome you're going for. What do you want at the end of the night? Do you want to be a stressed out, neurotic mess who's worried about, the perfect fold in the napkin, or having the perfect dishes, or the perfect this? Is that how you want to end your night? And she said, well, no, not really, because the reason I have people over is because I enjoy their company, and I enjoy, that's just such an important value of mine, is friends and connection. And so we shifted it for her to remember the outcome you're going for. The outcome is, I want to have fun with my friends. I want to have an experience with my friends. And when she focused on that, we were able to start to shift and release this concept of everything having to be perfect. This concept of wanting things to be perfect also keeps us from starting things, from doing things. It keeps us it's a prison, basically, in a lot of different areas of our life. But one way it shows up is that if you've ever had something that you wanted to do or create, there are a lot of limiting beliefs that we can unpack sometimes if you aren't doing it. But sometimes the big reason you're not doing something is because you're waiting for something to be perfect. And again, what does that even mean, right? And I wrote about this not too long ago. I had been wanting to start my blog for years, for probably 2 years. I had my domain name and I'd been wanting to do it. But what was I waiting on? I was waiting on it to be perfect, for the perfect time, for the perfect first post, for the perfect website design. And, about a year or so, probably a year and a half ago now, I just decided, fuck it, I'm just going to do it. And I released myself from that prison of perfection and decided that it was more important that I just put it out there, that I get out of my own way and just put it out there. Because that perfectionism is, like I said, it's a prison for us, but it's also this sort of protective mechanism that we hide behind. Because if we're not ever putting ourselves out there, if we're not ever showing our vulnerability in any way, then we feel like we won't ever be hurt, or we won't be judged, or we won't be ridiculed. But this comes back to the underpinning of all of the coaching that I do, comes back to that feeling of self-worth and love for yourself and confidence in yourself. Because what is perfectionism really? It's fear. It's fear of not being good enough. Because fundamentally, at some point in our lives, and it usually happens very, very young, and it doesn't even have to be associated with trauma or abuse or anything else, at some point we make this decision unconsciously that we have to be perfect in order to be worthy of love. And that's really what's underneath it. And I'm curious if you sit with where you see perfectionism come up in your life. I'm curious what you feel is really underneath it when you start to peel back the layers and ask yourself the question, why do I feel like I have to be perfect in order to receive love? Why is that a rule that I have? Because oftentimes we have these unconscious rules of who we have to be in the world in order to be worthy, in order to be accepted, and in order to be worthy of love. And what happens is we're then putting our validation and our self-worth on external sources. We are placing it on something that's not real, because there's nothing that is perfect. We as humans are fundamentally imperfect. We are perfect in all of our imperfections. And this idea that you hear a lot about of loving yourself and what does that mean? That also doesn't mean that you're perfect. It means that you love yourself for who you are, for all the quirks you have, and certainly you do the work on yourself. It's not an excuse to be an unbridled asshole. You guys know that's not what I mean by that. But that you love yourself for the things that you do if you make a mistake, because there's a guarantee in life you're going to make a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. It's part of the human condition. And it's about how you fix it. And you can either spend time beating yourself up over it, which, again, I've done the field research on this one. It's not effective, it's not constructive, and I don't recommend it. You can spend time beating yourself up about it, beating yourself up about not being good enough based on this ridiculous standard, or you can allow yourself the space to be human and go, yeah, I made a mistake. What led to that? How did I get to that point? What can I do to fix it? And what did I learn from it so I don't make that same mistake again? The other place we see this idea of feeling we have to be perfect come up is when we have these rules for who we have to be loved, is that it often comes up in romantic relationship. Romantic relationships bring up all of our shit. This is why you often hear people say, I always feel like I'm fine when I'm not in a relationship. And then I get into a relationship and, insert whatever. It's because the other people in a romantic relationship are a mirror that show you what within you still needs to be healed and worked through. And when you start to see it through that lens, you can be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But when we feel like we have to be perfect, and I am certainly an example of this, because I used to go into relationships thinking, if I'm just the perfect girlfriend, then I'll be loved. If I do this or I do this, I had all these rules within myself for who I needed to be to show up as in a relationship in order to receive love. And let me tell you what that does. That turns you into a performing poodle where you're essentially jumping through hoops, and there's nothing that anyone else can really connect to about that. And again, think about, going back to that example of the dinner party, think about who you connect to more. Do you connect to the person who is trying so hard to put on this face that they are perfect and flawless and never do anything wrong and never experience anything, unpleasant, that everything they touch just turns to gold, right? You can feel the energy behind that, and it's tense and it's fake and it's false and it's hollow, as opposed to someone who is just showing up and they're just real. They're doing the best they can in this human experience to be the best version of themselves. Not perfect, because perfect is not a thing. What you want to strive for, you want to strive to be the best version of yourself that you can, and take all your talents, your skills and abilities and do the best you can. But know that this idea of perfection is not something you're ever going to reach, and start to examine the rules that you have had for who you have to be loved, and bring that back within yourself, because the truth is, you are enough just as you are, just as you were born, just as you are right now in this minute, whatever age you are, whatever has happened to you in your life, whatever things you've done that in the back of your head going, yeah, well, if she'd only known about this thing that I did a couple years ago, she wouldn't be saying that. No, You're human. You make a mistake. Drop the shame. Drop the shame. Focus on the fact that you are enough. How would your life change if you shifted the rules you have for who you have to be in this world? How would your life change if instead of when you wake up in the morning, your brain is unconsciously going to all the ways you're not doing things well enough. You're not parenting well enough. You're not, the perfect employee. You're not the perfect this. You're not the perfect that. What if instead you just accepted yourself and loved yourself as you are in this moment? I love myself at whatever weight I am. If you're in debt or, again, we all make mistakes in life. But the way we shift that is we love ourselves for who we are now, because shame doesn't get us anywhere. And this pressure of having to be perfect, of having to live up to these rules that are really our own rules that we've created. They're all internal. This is an internal hell that we keep ourselves in. How different is that in your life? Oftentimes with clients who have children, the analogy that I will give them is, or the question I will ask them is, what do your children have to do in order for you to love them? And the answer I get 100% of the time is, well, nothing. I love my children. And then I ask, do your children ever irritate you? Do they ever do anything that drives you crazy? And of course they laugh and say, well, yes, there are plenty of things that they do. And at whatever age, whether they're toddlers or teenagers or, sometimes grown adults, is, well, yeah, there are things they do sometimes that I don't like, that really irritate me, that annoy me, that even make me angry. And I say, but do you still love them? And do you only love them if they act perfect, if they always make their bed, or if they never talk back, or if they always get straight A's? Is that really true? And they're often appalled. They go, well, no, of course I want them to do well and I want them to behave, but I love my children no matter what. And that is that unconditional love. It's divine love, ultimately, regardless of what your personal religious beliefs are. Divine love is unconditional love and acceptance of all, no matter what. There aren't any rules for it. So I'll challenge you to shift the way that you think about who you have to be in the world and sit with this idea, your own idea, of where you felt you had to be perfect, and think about what fear is really behind it for you if you don't meet that standard you've created of perfection. And I also want to challenge you when you feel those ideas, those concepts, that pressure come up within you of having to be perfect. If you see it in, an interaction or a relationship with someone else, use it as an opportunity to connect and even call it out. Maybe you're with somebody at work or you're in your relationship with your partner and you go, wow, I am really feeling, I feel so stressed out right now. And it's really because I feel like I need to do this perfectly. Do you ever feel that way? Use it as an opportunity to connect with someone. And when you feel that come up, give it a name. That's a lot of the work that I do with my clients, is bringing awareness to these things, because when we operate unconsciously, then you're letting the inmates run the asylum, right? Pardon the analogy, but bring awareness to it. And when you see that perfection come up, realize it for what it is and see what it feels like to shift it instead into love. And what if you just said to yourself, mentally or out loud in that moment, it's okay. I recognize this for what it is. I'm enough right now, just as I am. Even if you don't fully believe it yet, start there, because you are enough in your very core, just as you are. You are enough. There's nothing else you have to do. And the more that you believe that, and the more that you can heal that within yourself, the less you're going to feel that pull and that draw to meet this impossible standard externally. And the more your own relationships are going to shift, and the better your quality of life is going to be, because you're not constantly striving to achieve something that isn't even real. So let's get radical and break the cycle. And let's say that you believe with the same fervor that you've been believing this lie of perfectionism, that you believe that you are worthy of love and that you are enough just as you are. Try that on for size for a while and see how different your life feels. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Courage to Rise podcast. Visit my website, couragetorise.com, for more information on one-on-one coaching, group coaching programs, and other upcoming events. Remember, life's too short not to sparkle. Sparkle on.